know a ridiculous amount. Sorry? It's all good? Cool. One of the upsides to downsides to not knowing as much about the critters that I'm going to deal with is that it makes it difficult to actually protect any of them. So we have this thing where, alarmingly, we're discovering them and then losing them to science or to us in general. They're going extinct every now and then at about the same rate that we discover them. Recent DNA stuff has meant that we're actually discovering them slightly faster than we're losing them, which is kind of good, I guess. But you don't end up with a net lack of loss. You've still lost the things you lose, I guess. It's just that we're likely to have it more figured out by the time we lose them, I guess. So every now and then throughout the talk, I guess I might refer to DNA stuff and how that's changed the world of freshwater macroinvertebrates a little bit. Mainly I'm doing it secondhand because my co-author that you mentioned earlier, Edward Tsyrlin, is doing his PhD and that sort of stuff. So he bends my ear over a bit every now and then. And so I've almost been converted. I'm resisting, but I've almost been converted to thinking that DNA might hold something in the future for all of us that do science and zoology. All right, I am screen sharing. Am I doing, you got the talk, it works? All right, cool. I will do this. All right, so I think I said before that the big, really cool thing about waterbugs is that they are so amazingly diverse. This is, just to give you an idea, some of the astoundingly different body forms of freshwater macroinvertebrates or waterbugs that you can get. This is probably a good assemblage that you'd find in actually there's some of the things here are from rivers and some of these are from wetlands. In the top left of this frame, you can see there's a planarian, a flatworm, and you can see, normally you see these chaps just walking on, gliding around over flat surfaces like rocks and stuff. This gives you a feel for how they're actually much more mobile than that. This chap's swimming in the water, a bit like a Spanish, in the marine ecosystems, you get Spanish dancers, are these big flatwormy type things that can move through the sea. These little chaps are capable of it, they just don't do it very often. In the middle there, with the long leaf-like tails on the end, is a damselfly and a prey item, a little red wormy thing in front of it. Down the bottom left, there's a water mite. In the middle, at the bottom, there's a back swimmer. Top right, there's a stonefly, and bottom right, there's a thing we've sort of loosely called the regal maggot, I guess. And it's a tipulid or a cranefly larva. And across all of those body forms, there's insects, there's crustaceans, there's all sorts of things. Actually, I haven't got a crustacean up there, but we'll get to crustaceans later. All of the pictures that I'm going to show you are partially my work and are part of the stuff that went into the Waterbug book, which we mentioned earlier. They're also the stuff that does the illustrations for the Waterbug app, which you may be interested in if you want to identify bugs, or you can also use it to assess ecosystems. So, but I'll talk about that later too. But they're not just my work. A lot of them are the fault or the responsibility of Edward Tsyrlin, who is the chap with a dragonfly on his nose here, and Tom Sloan, who is the slightly nefarious looking chap there with the red shirt and the name tag. These two fellows have helped me as a team, I guess. We've photographed everything for the Waterbug book, and Tom Sloan's been involved in all of the little movies and stuff that we make about waterbugs, and I'll inflict some of those on you in a little bit of time. When you go out to look at waterbugs, they're one of those things where you've got to sort of, there's a little bit more effort involved, I guess, than just looking at stuff when you go for a walk. If you go for a walk, things tend to race out in front of you, and they're large and they're, the size of your hand, and you can tell where they are. Waterbugs tend to all be, roughly thumbnail sized or smaller, and they live in rivers and wetlands. And as a result, to actually look at them, you've got to go to some effort. This is gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of gear you might need to do this. This is a sample in a white tray. It's just been captured with a net out of a nearby wetland and then spread out. And the main process, I guess, that we go through with these things is that we're hunting. You spend 20 minutes, half an hour, sometimes much more than that, depending on how zoned out you get. Just looking into these white trays, looking for little things that wriggle, and then you chase them around with plastic spoons and pipettes, and it's quite good fun. But it's the way they move and stuff that will alert you to their presence first off. But it's not until you get a magnifying glass on them that you get to sort of really appreciate the intricacies and the diversity of these critters. Probably the thing that I've spent the larger part of the last 10 years working on and trying to get to a stage where it is serviceable, I guess, and can be used to identify these animals is taking all of the scientific, taxonomic and descriptive stuff that we use as ecologists or zoologists or taxonomists, and then trying to make that accessible by one of the really big groups that exist in Australia, Waterwatch generally, or Streamwatch if you're over in Sydney. And I've been trying to sort of spend that, over those 10 years, I think we've taken all of the knowledge that we have as scientists and tried to make it accessible, I guess, to people who want to use it for Waterwatch and stuff. The main reason for that is that they then can convert like a list of critters, which I'll show you later, into an assessment of a site. And you can say this bit of river's good, this bit of river's bad, based on, you know, what you find there. To actually do this, we had this really cool thing where the Victorian government funded us to actually sit down with Waterwatch and figure out what was actually possible to identify and what wasn't. And by going through that process, we invented a thing that we called agreed level taxonomy. And what it is it basically acknowledges the fact that you're never going to be able to identify things the same way a trained scientist in a laboratory is going to. Like if you've got all the time in the world, the stereo one, really good magnification, you can sit down and you can split apart your water bugs into species. And it takes a lot of time. It's actually a very, very arduous task. It's quite good fun, but it does take a lot of time. In the field with live animals, it's simply not possible. And so what we had to do with the Waterwatch program is to try and figure out what was actually feasible. And so this agreed level taxonomy does this thing where some animals you can identify more than others. It sounds bleeding obvious when you say it out loud like that. But what we had to do, I guess, was go through the critters and figure out what was possible with each set of critters. And that's what agreed level taxonomy turned out to be. And that's the underlying structure, I guess, if you ever open up the Waterbug app. That's what's in there. And the end point that comes out of that is that we end up with all sorts of horrible things done to the formal taxonomy. But generally speaking, we can combine things into new common names or, you know, to actually group them. Just to give you an example, the slide tells you a little bit about why we want to do that. And I guess the main thing is that we're trying to get a method which you can use without being a trained scientist in the field with live animals. And I guess the other cool thing about the stuff we've done here is that because it uses live animals, you can actually put them back in the creek afterwards. Traditionally, as a scientist, we tend to be the angels of death. We wander around the landscape putting stuff in bottles. Everybody since Charles Darwin has pickled everything from orangutans to sea slugs, and they're all in wonderful museums and stuff. But there comes a point where that stuff isn't practical, and it's kind of nice to actually let them go home at the end of the day. And that's kind of one of the other things that we wanted to do with the National Waterbug Blitz, which is the thing that agreed level taxonomy turned into. The thing that ALT recognizes is this. If you were to use formal taxonomy, at family level, you would call these two animals the same. They would be family Nymphal, which is the water scorpions. If you try and tell a grade 4 or a grade 5 that they have to call those two animals the same, they will laugh at you, they'll whinge, they'll cry. And they probably should, because they're perfectly capable, given these two animals, of doing a genus level identification, which is much harder. And it's one of those things where if you can do it, why not celebrate that and actually use it? So what we've done with ALT is we've maintained the separation of these two. The fellow on the right is Lacotrephes, the fellow on the left is Renata, and one's a stick water scorpion, the other one's a leaf water scorpion. They're very different. In contrast, these chaps are all from different families of caddisfly, and they all look the bloody same. If you haven't got a microscope set up and all the patients in the world, they've pretty much blended together. And so what we've done with these guys is the opposite. We've lumped them all together. And because they're such a diverse set of taxonomically disjunct groups, we've had to come up with a horrible common name for them. We use my Grand's favorite biscuits were ginger nuts, and we thought it described them quite well. So we've run with ginger nuts as the common name for these chaps. And it works. In the field, they've got a sort of a maggoty looking body and an orange head, and they move quite fast. So that's the best idea you're going to be capable of doing. And so those chaps are all lumped. So that's basically what we've done to the taxonomy of water bugs. We've lumped things that you can't tell apart and split things up if you can actually tell them apart with a little bit of effort. The whole process happened in Warburton with this group of lovely people. This is a bunch of water watchers from about 10 years ago. And they were amazing. They were dedicated. They did about 3 days end on end and were so sick of water bugs by the time they walked out of this thing that I'm surprised that we saw any of them ever again. I'm glad to say that we did, and they came back and they have demonstrated, I guess, that this process was worth doing because they've gone on to run their own water watch groups and they're coordinators in various spots around Victoria. It's been nice actually being involved with them. And Waterwatch Victoria continues to be a really good bunch of geezers to hang out with and get this sort of stuff done. Do acknowledge the old taxonomy. This is the back page of our agreed level taxonomy guide, which was sort of a precursor to the Waterbug app. And what it does is it uses really, really obvious body morphology up. And you can see it sort of works a bit like a dendritic tree, and in tiny little letters, you can probably make them out. You can see that it splits animals up based on whether they have a shell, haven't got a shell, whether they have legs or whether they haven't got legs, whether they've got 6 legs, whether they've got 8 legs, whether they've got a certain number of tails, all that sort of stuff. And using those, you can very rapidly basically pull stuff out to what we call order level, which is quite a coarse taxonomic level. And once you're there, all of the animals that you have within that group are from the same order. So, for example, and the orders are generally the sorts of levels that people tend to recognize animals at from the invertebrates anyway. So things like dragonflies, people will recognize as dragonflies. Mayflies, people will recognize as mayflies. And that's Odonata and Ephemeroptera and, Coleoptera, the beetles. That level is sort of the way we view the world anyway. It's sort of a natural level to draw a line through. With the Waterbug app, we ended up trying to invent slightly different ways of identifying these things. We went with the standard dichotomous key, which you can see at the top there, which does this, has it got legs, hasn't it got legs type of approach. And that works really well. But one of the big things that we found with taxonomic keys is that with every identification that you make, you have to go right back to the beginning and be asked all of the bleeding obvious questions again. So if you've got an animal with legs, you know that you're going to have to go through the first 7 questions until you get to the leg question. And eventually it becomes a little bit tedious. And so what we invented was a thing called Speedbug, which acknowledges the fact that many of these animals have really, 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 really distinctive body forms. And you can see this little selection of critters, I guess, in the bottom right there. You'd have to be daft to actually confuse these critters with one another. There's a sphenid or a water penny on the right there, and it's wildly different to a mosquito or a mosquito larva or a wriggler. And the black fly larva, otherwise known as a chicken drumstick animal by my friend Tom, or the blef, which is, basically looks like a whole bunch of gummy bears gaffer taped together. They're all really wildly different in their body forms. So that's sort of where we took a whole bunch of our taxonomic keys, but we're very keen not to leave behind the stuff that makes these things obvious. This is an example of the sorts of IDs that you can do with the Waterbug app. And this is probably one of the easier examples, but it gives you an idea instantly of the sort of stuff that when you sit down with a tray of wriggling bugs, and the first 10 minutes is a little bit overwhelming. You go, oh my goodness, it's just all moving and they all look the same. But after you've calmed down a little bit and you've had a bit of a look and you've got your rational wits about you again, you'll start to notice things like these 2 animals are different. So this is a robust or a slender back swimmer. Genus Enotheres is the robust one. Genus Anisops is the slender one. And you can see just from that picture there that they're quite noticeably different. This picture here is to give you an idea of what they look like in a white tray. One of the things you'll notice about the couplet there, couplet 9, is that it also refers to the way these animals move. And I guess throughout this talk, I'd like to show you why that's such an important thing. As a scientist training in my youth, we would have hundreds and hundreds of different pickled animals inflicted on us, and we never ever really knew how they moved, because they don't anymore once they've been pickled and shoved in little glass vials. And so there's this whole suite of characteristics that are actually really, really, really useful that are denied the laboratory-based scientist. And so it's been really nice tacking on movement and color, because that's the other thing that happens if you preserve something in ethanol, all the color disappears. So it's been really lovely being able to put the color and movement back into these keys. And so we use the traditional taxonomic, morphology, but we also use color and movement when we can. Just to give you a look at what these things look when you're up close to them. This is a slender back swimmer, throwing its air bubble from the water surface there. And this is a robust back swimmer doing a similar thing. And you can see they're quite noticeably different when you've magnified them up this way. Excuse me. All right, so this is what the Waterbug app looks like. It's freely available. It's on Android and Apple, and it basically does a whole bunch of the work that the Waterbug book would have done originally. But on top of that, it does this thing where you can use it to assess a riverine site. So if you have a bit of river near you that you're interested to know whether it's knackered or not, you can actually dial up all the bugs that you find in it, and it will give you an assessment based on the critters that you find in that site. So that's an additional thing that's kind of cool about it. I just have to mention it because it's there. It's free. Have a look at it, have a play. But this talk is mainly about critters. I guess probably one of the groups of critters that is most known, I guess, by people out there are the mayflies. If any of you are trout fishermen of any shape or form, then you'd be familiar with these. They form the bulk, I guess, of the shrapnel that's thrown at trout at various times to try and lure them into death. And the ones I deal with tend to be what they would call wet flies, so things that are underneath the water. At some stage, all of the insects that you'll find in a river or a wetland will actually emerge from the water. They'll split down the back, or they'll go through a pupal phase, and then they'll come out as terrestrial form. So these mayflies look like this when they're underwater, and then I'll show you some slides in a minute of what they look like when they emerge. You can see already on these animals that even though they're fully aquatic at this stage, I'm just going to do something snazzy with a red pen if I can get it to work. You can see these lemon yellow things there. They are actually what we call wing buds, and inside the little leathery cover that's in there are the convolutions, I guess, of the next molt. And what will happen is that animal will split down the back, unfurl those wings, and you've probably seen footage of dragonflies doing that sort of thing. Mayflies do very much the same thing, and then they'll fly off and reproduce and lay eggs in the river. One of the cool things about those structures, I guess, is they're the same for all the different animals. But I guess by putting these two animals side by side, the canid and the baited, you get a feel for the fact that there are quite large differences in these guys. So these chaps were probably both about 4 mil long, not particularly large, but with a magnifying glass, they'll look not unlike they do on the screen there. And once you've got the magnifying glass up, you'll be able to notice that this chap here has gills all along the side of his abdomen there. They're like little plates. Whereas this chap here has all those gills covered over with a little membranous cover. And it's thought that that stops the silt getting in. So the canids are very much more typical of silty streams. So those are the sorts of characters that traditionally we would have used. If you sample these things roughly with a net, all the various gills and antennae drop off, and so those identifications can become harder. Something that does stay the same, though, is the way that these animals move. This may or may not work, bear with me. What am I doing? I'm just trying to get rid of my pointer. Yay, there we go. So here's 3 different types of mayfly, all of them down simultaneously on the screen. I hope that doesn't crash your bandwidth. But you'll notice that the chaps on the left there, the little beards, have this sort of Huntsman Spider-like posture. They're very flat-legged and they sort of scurry along. The baitids, in contrast, in the middle, swim like little tiny fish in bursts. And then the canids on the far right there, they're very much more a sort of a seahorsing or a rocking horse sort of an approach to life, or movement rather. Those sorts of things, when you can barely see the little animal, are extremely useful for identifying it. And by recognizing those 3 ways of moving, you've actually done family level IDs on mayflies, which is kind of cool. And it's done without a magnifying glass and definitely with a microscope. It's one of those things that's quite nice once you've got these things to work with. And in the Waterbug app, one of the cool things about it being an app is we can actually have little videos and stuff. So when you get to the end of your ID, one of the confirmatory characters is how does the animal move? And so you can watch these little videos just to confirm that you've got the right identification when you've got to the end of it. Like I said before, a lot of these animals do this thing where they'll start out small and get big. Well, all animals do that, don't they? They all start small and they'll start to get big. They start out as eggs and they end up as adults. But there are 2 different ways of going through life if you're an insect. And they change, I guess, the way these animals look. The larval life cycle, which is on the left there, is typical of things like your beetles, your true flies, your diptera. And what they do is they have this thing where the larva is basically an elastic-sided garbage bag, really. It's a big, very plastic bodied animal with a hard set of mouth parts on the front end that it uses to just stuff itself with food and get as big as it can as fast as it can. Once it's reached a certain size, it will then pupate, very much like the very hungry caterpillar, if you can think back to that extremely erudite literature of your youth. And then once it comes out of the sarcophagus-like pupal stage, it'll be this magnificent flying machine, which has suddenly popped into existence despite not looking anything like that in its previous form. In contrast, the nymphal life cycle is much more straightforward and makes a whole bunch more sense to watch. The nymph will start off looking very similar to the adult of the critter that you'll end up with. The big difference here, you can see on the top of the right-hand side there, you can see all of the those bands are actually different body segments. Those body segments will be visible until the bug, or the hemiptera in this case, grows a full set of wings. And at that stage, they'll get covered over. So you can tell you've got a fully sexually mature adult when those stripy abdominal segments disappear underneath the wings, like in the bottom picture there. Mayflies run with option 2. They do the nymphal life cycle. And when they pop out the other end, they tend to look a little bit like the chaps on the right here. So this is 2 of the critters that we identify in the Waterbug app. And you can see both of these animals are from the family Phlebeidae. They've got that Huntsman Spider sort of look about them. Remember that one that was running around at the far left of the slide before last? The one cool thing that makes these guys different is that this chap at the top there has these wonderfully frilly gills. Each gill is divided into what we call it has a sort of a digitate setup. And so it's not just one little leaf, it's a little leaf with 5 or 6 different ends. And the end result is a whole bunch of gills that look a lot like Christmas tinsel. And you can see that's what's on the fellow at the top there. And in the bottom, you've got a much simpler and more standard, run-of-the-mill leptophlebiid. So this fellow here has little I'll do it on this one. Leaf-shaped gills down around. I'm just using a pointer, not a pen. That's not going to work. Pen. Oops. Anyway, top guy, frilly, bottom guy, just leaf-like. You can see in the middle picture there's this, it's a little bit trippy to look at, but what's actually happening is the aquatic nymph has come to the surface, split along its back, and then the terrestrial flying adult has stepped through the shoulders where the skin was, left the skin floating in the water, and then is just floating precariously on the water surface just above the shed skin, which is underwater. If you can sort of take all that in, it's a fairly confused photograph, but it's got everything in it, which is kind of nice. The really cool thing about mayflies is that they have not one adult phase, but 2 adult stages. They have what's called a dun. So you can see in the top right here, that opaque set of wings is actually a set of wings with another set of skin on top. And so they'll molt further and emerge as the fellow on the bottom there with the clear wings, but they have to go through a sort of contortional process in the middle there to get rid of that extra layer of skin. And they go from being quite rubbish flyers in the top right there to quite erudite. That's not the right word, but it should be the right word. It isn't, though. It's totally the wrong word. They're agile is the word I'm looking for. Once all that comes to a sad ending, they'll end up like this. This is just a dead female mayfly who's laid all her eggs and is spent and tends to return to the water, and then will get gobbled by trout if she's unlucky, or all sorts of things will be quite happy to tear her body apart and use it for bits. The mayflies are quite diverse. We've shown you the leptophlebiids. The batids look like this. They're a much smaller thing. These are the guys that swam in little bursts like fishes. You can see there's a dun and there's a fully emergent one. Again, the opaque wings and then the clear wings when they get through the final stage. And then the canids on the right there, that's our chap with the little covers over the gills. Why does that happen? It's been interesting. And then down the bottom, there's the adult. Some of these animals don't look all that different from their aquatic stage once they've emerged. Probably one of the best examples of this is one of your endangered critters, the Mcdonald Wang wingless stonefly, actually goes through this entire process looking exactly the same, but can walk on land, which is a strange thing. Stoneflies, this is a couple of examples here, do this thing where they'll often, there's a large eusthenid on the left there, they tend to be predatory, but as a group, they fill a whole bunch of niches, I guess, in the riverine landscapes mainly. There's the big predators, the eusthenids there. On the right, there's a sort of a more detritivorous kind of a fellow. And once they pop out, they'll look like these fellows in the bottom right of this slide here. And it's very much the same body plan, but with a couple of wings all fold up on it to give them a sort of a cigar-like overall look. The cool thing about most of the stoneflies, but particularly the Gryphopterigidae, which we call the Gryphops or the fluffy bums in the ALT key, is the way they move. They have this thing where they're hinged a little bit like lizards tend to be. So they've got that side-to-side kind of movement. This guy, like I said before, is from what we're calling the Gryphops or the fluffy bums. Have got their common name, the fluffy bums, from the fact that on the very end of their abdomen is actually a breathing apparatus. So it's very common of gills. And they'll move it like that to get rid of the water that's been deoxygenated by their gills and to get new, fresh, oxygenated water. So it's quite a spectacular little bit of gear and all sorts of behaviours involved there. Mayflies and stoneflies are two of the groups of animals that are typical of really nice condition rivers, I guess. But there's another group. So the mayflies, the stoneflies, and the caddisflies are traditionally thought to be indicators of good water quality. The caddisflies do a whole bunch of body forms. Probably one of the more amazing ones you'll see are these guys. This is the net spinning caddis. The bottom right shows you an amazing piece of workmanship. This is a little net, not unlike a fly screen, I guess, but put together by that matey fella up on top there. When you throw these, the workmanship is immaculate. Like the gaps between each of those strands of what is a silk-like structure there are all perfect, absolutely perfect. And that's used to catch detritus and small animals from the river as it flows past. And these things tend to live in large aggregations in spots where the flow is just right. And so you'll end up with sort of like little villages stuck to the side of rocks underwater with all their little nets out, sieving the goodies from the passing water. They live in that structure there. You'll notice there's the mesh on one side, and then there's sort of a messy lean-to just to the left of it. That lean-to is where the maggoty thing on top tends to live or spend its days. And because it's in a little house, it's got this thing where it's maximized its gills. And you can see all that its hairy chest there is all gill structures because although it's in a nice spot in the river, which should have lots of oxygen because the water is moving through quickly, it actually has gone and put itself in a hole in the middle of that. And so it needs to have quite an efficient oxygen removal mechanism to get the most out of the water that's in its little house. When these things mature, they pupate like the caterpillars do, and then they emerge and they look like the fellow in the bottom left there. That's a snowflake caddis, is the name that the trout fishery fellows give. And these guys will swarm. Sometimes you'll get lovely days, about this time of year actually, and from now on, where you'll get hundreds of these emerging simultaneously, and they'll do these lovely dances just above the water, where the females bob up and down and the males race through the middle. No, other way around. The males bob up and down, the females race through the middle. And then once they've been impregnated, they'll sort off somewhere else and go and lay eggs in the water, trying to find a place that would, be a good place for their young caddisflies when they grow up. So they're finding just places just upstream of fast water and stuff like that. That's a net spinning caddis. It's sort of a free-living caddis. The caddis get split into these two groups. There's some that can move around and don't have a case and are quite fast and often predatory. These chaps have a sort of a case, but they're stuck to the side of the rock. By far the most well-known caddis are those that make their own little cases. This fellow here is Ocetus, is the genus, and he is what we call a lowland attack caddis in the Waterbug app. And that case that he's carrying around behind him there is a tubular sand grain construction, and it's made by using the silk that these guys can produce to glue all of the little grains of sand together into this armoring. It's like a case of armor, I guess. And it'll stop it getting eaten by medium-sized predators that might want a piece of that. In the previous slide, that the abdomen on these things is sort of a squidgy thing. That's incredibly edible, I guess. And so lots of things try to take a piece out of them. And their response to that is to build these structures for themselves up. Caddisflies are one of my favorite groups in the waterbugs. The main reason is because of their architectural abilities. This is a sand grain case. They'll use all sorts of building materials. This is the same genus but a different species, which has built a log cabin sort of equivalent, I guess. You can see there it's just cutting a length of green to size. The cool thing about this case is that as the animal gets bigger, all they need to do is put on extensions at the front. And you can see as the case tails off in the distance and goes out of focus, you'll see where it's out of focus, it's actually brown. That's because that's the old case that was necessary to cover the much younger animal. And as it's become older and longer, it has to build these additional frames to cover its body. One I found in Tasmania, I don't think you get these in Victoria, is this thing down the bottom left there. It's like it called shingle caddis, and it actually cuts little plates with a beautiful sort of amount of precision. And what will happen is they will they're cut so nicely that they'll give the case that they build a final sort of a bit like a dog canine. It's got this recurved sort of a section to it, so it's really quite spectacular and very aerodynamic in the flowing water. When all these things grow up, they end up like this. This is the bottom one's a leptocerid. I think the top one's still erythrid, but I can't remember. And they all do look bloody same at this stage, until you look at the venation on the wings and stuff like that. So you really do need the microscope for this stage. These look for all the world like your standard Lepidopteran moths. The big thing that'll tell you that you have a caddisfly rather than a moth is the fact that these chaps have enormous palps, actually palps out the front. So you can see that bottom chap there has these enormous, looks like you've got an extra set of arms stuck on the front of its face. Those tell you that you've got a caddisfly, not a moth. So if you're ever, looking at stuff next to a that's the way you tell them apart. That and the ridiculously long antennae. When they're flying, these antennae are so long that the animal has to tilt its body slightly. So they have this very inefficient way of flying to accommodate for these ridiculously long antennae. I do hope they're used for something because they seem extremely inconvenient otherwise, if they're not getting used otherwise. So what I've given you now, I guess, is the three main types of the critters that we use for determining water quality, I guess. But water bugs are way more diverse than that, like I said initially. Here's a Gordian worm. These are they're cool. They're sort of parasitic in cockroaches and grasshoppers, and then they inflict a thirst on the host, and they wander the water, and then when they'll burst out of the side of the host and leave it sort of basically a husk of its former self, because they can take up to about 80% of the body mass of the host. And then they go and they have these amazingly big sort of orgiastic meetings where they'll all swarm together and they'll spawn off eggs, and the little larvae will crawl into the grass and the leaf litter and get eaten by cockroaches again. So it's a wonderful, very big life cycle. But they're probably one of the more spectacular riverine invertebrates that isn't an insect, I guess. Other things that are quite common are things like amphipods. You'll probably recognize this one as looking a bit like the stuff that you get in the compost, the leaf hoppers, not leaf hoppers, down the beach you get sand hoppers, and then you get terrestrial amphipods as well that you get in compost and stuff. The amphipods are quite common. There's, in your neck of the woods, there's a couple of thought to be endangered things up in the Dandenongs, which are the genetics is doing interesting things with, and they're turning up in other parts of Victoria as well. So they're going to be a fascinating one with the advent of genetics, because taxonomically they're always quite hard to work with because they're quite what we call morphologically plastic. So, any one species can have all sorts of ways it'll be slightly different. And so it's really difficult to tell when you've got two different species or whether you've just got two slightly different critters from the same species. Other critters that you might get, particularly in your wetlands around the corner, are shrimp or prawns. This one's a prawn. It's got sort of longish legs on there. This particular unfortunate example has a parasitic isopod stuck to the side of its head. And I've always thought this is one of those amazing examples of evolution. Like this isopod is exactly the right size that all of the shrimp's amazingly agile legs cannot get it off. So you can see where all the kneecaps are on those legs. They're all the isopod is exactly the right shape that none of them are any use to get rid of it. So this poor thing lives with what would effectively be like having a corgi strap on the side of your head for the entirety of its life until it drops dead. And this little isopod is slowly chewing a hole in the side of the shrimp. So it's not only going to end one way eventually. So this is, I guess, a good example of the crustaceans. Elizabeth was saying at the beginning of the talk that they'd just been to one of the wetlands in Sandringham and that it had just recently been re-wetted. Re-wetting is one of those times where you get the most amazing crustaceans. This little bit of footage here is from a pond around the corner from a place I used to play. And it gives you an idea of the hidden diversity that you get in wetlands. So wetlands, I was going to say even if they dry out, but almost particularly if they dry out, can be these amazingly diverse ecosystems, because in between being dry and in between being fully flooded, the water in that wetland is going to do all sorts of strange and horrible things. It's going to have conductivity that is through the roof at some stage. It's going to have conductivity that is really, really dilute at other stages. And so you end up with these variations giving you this amazing slew of different animals throughout the life of the wetland as it dries up. This bunch of critters, what you get in the first 2 weeks, so when the freshwater first hits, which is what you guys are probably seeing currently in Sandy Bay. And those large things that were coming through at Lepidurus, there are a shield shrimp, there's a conchostracan going through there as well. And you can just see it's a seething mess of stuff. And what these guys are doing is most of them are keying into the fact that there'll be an algal bloom of some sort at this stage. And so there's lots of little herbivorous crustaceans making the most of the fact there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of algal cells just going up for grabs and trying to chow down on those. And then slowly, as those guys get to the stage where they're bigger and fatter and juicier, you'll end up with more and more predators in the system, and it'll do what ecosystems do. And then eventually, because it's a wetland, it'll. I'm rapidly coming up to the end of what should have been the time. So what I might do is whiz through. Dragonflies exist. Dragonflies. They also do moving stuff too. You can see this thing. Dragonflies jet water out of their bum. Kids love that. And damselflies, where they move in a more sinuous fashion. Once again, good example of the movement being one of those things that you can use to ID animals. But I guess what I wanted to show you at some stage in this talk was what you can turn waterbugs into. And I will do that after I've shown you Green Death, because Green Death is awesome. This is one of Tom's favorite bits of footage. This is a dragonfly killing a backswimmer, which isn't something you get to see every day. Green Death was cool. This is actually a tank, believe it or not. Tom spent lots and lots of time furnishing these, and Green Death killed hundreds and hundreds of things. Never when the camera was turned on, except for this one instance. And eventually she emerged and turned into a beautiful dragonfly and flew off. But one of the cool things about Green Death was because she was so merciless, we did get some good footage of her. And you can see how her amazing mouth parts work here. The mouth parts on dragonflies are this thing a bit like the mouth parts on an alien, if you've ever seen the Alien movies. And they fold like an arm underneath the head. And then they just simply reach out. And they've got these spring-loaded claws on either side of the mouth parts that grab them all. And then once the arm retracts back into the head, it brings the item into line with the mandibles, which then proceed to sort of chew the head / middle / face, whatever it is, off the prey item. And it's all very macabre, but really quite spectacular. You get a good look at the arm there from the side, or the menton. It's one of those mouth parts that's amazingly modified, but extremely efficient, very effective for what it's been designed for. I guess in this talk, one of the things I wanted to do was to inflict these bits of video on you, because they give you insight into the way these critters exist day to day. But I guess I don't want to leave you without talking a little bit about what we can turn lists of critters into. So if you go to a river and you studiously document every animal you find there, in the first instance, all you'll end up with is a list of animals. But because we're working with, and generally speaking, if you go to a horrible river, you'll find less animals than if you go to a nice river. Just to give you an example, this is Newtown Rivulet around the corner from where I live in Hobart. That's down the bottom where it's very urban, 4 animals. This is up the top where it just comes off Mount Wellington, and you'll notice that there's instantly much more diversity in the really nice place. The other cool thing we know about waterbugs is that some of them tolerate pollution and some of them don't. And what we've done as freshwater ecologists, I guess, over the last 100 years is these observations for, that animal only ever occurs in really nice places and, that animal can tolerate anything, is we can actually assign each of these animals a score between 0 and 10. That's what you do with science. You take big, elegant, lovely things and you turn them into a number between 0 and 10. And what we do is, by using those observations of tendency, I guess, in these critters, you assign each one a critter, and then you basically average the critters' scores that you find at a site. This is an overly simplified version of it, but this is how we get those red and green dots. So at a good site, you might expect more critters, but you also might expect some critters that have like scores around the 9, 7, 6. Whereas at a bad site, you will only get the critters that score lowly. So, the diversity will be down, but also what we call the signal score, stream invertebrate grade number, average level, will be down as well. So that's how we take a list of critters and we turn it into these wonderful maps of different places in Australia. The really cool thing about this is we can use our agreed level taxonomy, which I introduced you to earlier, to turn really expensive data sets that the governments in various states put together. We can put them down so that they're comparable to what you would do if you took out a plastic tray and a magnifying glass and had a crack at it on the weekend. So this data is comparable to stuff that you can do, with a little bit of training, admittedly, but a bit of practice. And I guess that's what the National Waterbug Blitz was all about. It's still up and running, and these maps are there for browsing. If this was a real website, if you were to click on that Victoria map, you could zoom into your neck of the woods and see if the EPA in Victoria, Watch, have done any sites near you. And that data will be dated, so you get a feel for whether that people are still actively doing that sort of work in your part of the world. Thank you to a lot of people for doing this, for getting the Waterbug Blitz up and running. It's a really awesome resource. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, I urge you to go and check it out. It's at waterbugblitz.org.au. If you're interested in critters, but not so much about the assessing them, you might be interested in a little video we put together recently too, which is called Mere River on YouTube, and it's quite cool. I think that's probably my allotted amount of time. When you do go into the website, there's all sorts of cool, techno data. You can look at sites over time like this, see if they get better or worse, and you can figure out what's upstream, whether it's all horrible or whether it's all nice. But I'll leave that there. Knowing it's there means you go and play with it, and that's basically me. I'll stop now.
Oh, thank you very much, John. Does anyone have any questions? So just in the Q&A, you can type in a question, anything you'd like to know about.
There was a what is conductivity in there. That is basically the amount of salt in water alters its ability to conduct electricity. So if you've got more salt in water, it will be more conductive for the electricity. And we use it sort of roughly as an indicator of how much stuff has gone into a river. So you'll find if you have a wetland and it's got a certain amount of stuff going on it, it will have a low EC when the water comes in and it's all fresh and it's just rainwater. And then as it dries up, the concentration of those salts will increase, and so the conductivity will increase. So that's what I was talking about there.
Thanks, John. I can see Chris has gone and found the YouTube video, so there's a link to that in the question and answer, folks. So thank you for that, Chris.
Cool. Cool.
There is a question from Natalie asking, do you ever use sound to measure biodiversity of water bugs? Hi, Natalie.
So there are some people that are looking into that. What's his name? It's one of those things where it's extremely cool and it's a great idea, but there's only a limited number of critters that actually do sounds in the aquatic waterbug world. Probably the most famous is the water boatmen do this thing where the males stridulate, and they basically have these pegs on one of their legs and they run them across their body and make a loud noise as a result, which is sort of like an kind of a thing. And if you get a whole bucket of 100 of those, you can whack your ear over the top and it's quite a cacophony. But it travels through the water as well. And they're quite famous for all sorts of things. I think being the loudest animal when scaled for size and having the largest and most loud penis, I think, is the thing that they're famous for. If you go and look up water boatman, Dodge looking up, just go stridulate. That's probably the term to look up. And you'll find little recordings of that. But it's not a consistent thing. Like lots of these guys are quite quiet. And particularly in rivers, you can imagine if you ever stick a microphone in a river, the noise of running water and rolling rocks and stuff means that you'd have to be extremely loud to be heard over that. And so things don't tend to make that noise. I know it's more possible in wetlands where the background noises are lower. And there are people looking into that at the moment. But I suspect that they'll end up with 3 types of beetle that do it and 4 types of water boatmen. And if you want to know about everything that's in the wetland, you've missed about, 9/10 of everything else that was there, just concentrating on those guys. So it's not really a diversity measure, but it definitely gives you a feel for those guys being in there or not.
Paul, further to that, would calling and making noise attract predators? Or is that a communication thing between the species?
That's one of those things that all critters have to, like even mammals, everything has to, that trade-off between making noise to attract a mate and making noise and having your head bitten off is very much part of being an animal. So absolutely, it's a thing, and it's a thing for many, many animals. Birds would be a really good example of that. You'll want to carry on enough that you find a partner, but you don't want to have, goshawks and stuff tearing you into little pieces before you get to reproduce. So it's a tightrope.
Right.
How does a flood impact water bugs? Good question. If you're in a river and the flood is enough to start the boulders moving, it can, adult water bugs. There's you don't want your head squished, basically. And so it's thought that a lot of these bugs can actually sense pressure differences in the water and will actually then, as a result, burrow into the gravel and get out of the way so that the rolling rocks as they come past don't kill them. Lots of other things have, like those caddisflies that I was talking about, some of those have amazingly strong cases. And even though they have boulders bounce off them, they, come out the other end looking roughly the same as they did it, before they got hit with a rock. So it's one of those things where you have the avoid or survive sort of techniques come up. But one of the things that floods can do that I hadn't actually thought about until recently, we've had quite a lot of water in the rivers in Hobart in the last 2 months, and quite violent water too. So it was moving things down. And what it's done in our urban waterways is it's brought a lot of so remember I was telling you can use the bugs to actually tell you whether a bit of river is knackered or not. Last year when we did it, it all made sense. It was really rather lovely. There were, urban sites, and you went and looked at the bugs and they were not there. There was lots of maggots and worms, and it was all very horrible. And we all got to go, look at that, and impacted in horrible urban site and feel very clever. And then this year with all the flooding, all the good bugs, because we have Mount Wellington at the top of this catchment, it's just spewed nice bugs into all of the urban rivers. And so now when you wander around, all of these lovely patterns that I've been telling people don't exist anymore. And so I look like I've been lying to people. So that's one of the other things that happens with floods. It'll change. You mark my words.
So how do insects and bugs get there in the first place if it's a contained pond? Is it just by wind and animals dropping the eggs in, or?
There's all sorts of things. Different critters will move different ways. Eggs is definitely one. So a lot of those microcrustaceans, like in that soup, they'll have an egg that is really quite small. And there's examples of that have been found. So some of the smaller planktonic jobs, they've found the same critters that we have in southern Australia in Antarctic and Macquarie Island lakes, because they've just been blown down there by that sort of disturbance. In contrast, things like water mites have this really cool thing where they don't have an aerial phase at all. They don't fly. But they do this thing where they have two different ways of eating, I guess. And so they can prey upon little microcrustacean things, and they'll just eat them whole. Or they're probably like little tins of food with legs on them, actually. So they probably just crack the tin and eat the insides. But the other thing they'll do is they'll be more like a tick. And so if you can imagine a damselfly walking to the edge of the pond and then splitting down the back and being, when insects molt their skins, the new skin is very, very soft. And so what these cheeky little ticks, little mites will do is they'll wander up the body of the damselfly and lodge in an armpit while they're still soft. And then when the damselfly takes off, they'll get dispersed from one wetland to another. And that's why you'll have this really weird pattern for water mite distributions. It's basically luck as to, what they hitched a ride on. But it's one of those cool things.
Very cool. Thank you. Any other questions? I think we will experiment a lot when we do our waterbug morning on Sunday, October the 2nd, and we'll learn quite a bit by the looks of things. I hope we have some waterbugs there.
Cool.
So I can see one thing here, just the signal, is it only
Yeah,
for
I see
streams?
that one.
Yep.
Signal is only for streams. There was one designed for ponds in WA. Ponds are really hard because they do this thing. Remember I was saying they wet up and then they dry down and they wet up and they dry down? Because they do that, all of the animals in a wetland have to be tolerant. So do you remember that green to red slide? Most of the things that live in a wetland are from orange down. And so if you use a signal score that's developed for rivers on a wetland, it'll come out looking horrible. And it's not its fault. It's simply because everything in the wetland is robust. And so there is a modification, I think it was called ponds or something. One of those ones where they put lots and lots of effort into an acronym that sounded vaguely relevant, but it meant that the words that were in the acronym no longer made any sense. And I can't remember. It was something like ponds or wets or, you know, something along those lines. But it was effective for a small group of wetlands in WA. And they had really good ideas for how to extend that, but it was never actually made into an easy to use thing. So I guess the answer is probably not. But what you can do is you can look at your wetland and see how it changes, even in terms of the signal score over time. So we have this thing where there's a whole bunch of, over near Geelong, there's a whole bunch of wetlands, and there was some PhD work done in the Western Plains there, where they looked at signal scores on those bugs. And they, you know, they tracked variation and, you know, could tell horrible wetlands from nice wetlands using that, but only by looking at them all and coming up with their own rules for what was good and what was bad. So you sort of have to re-modify them a little bit to fit purpose.
Okay.
So no, but yes.
So with your inside knowledge of Sandringham, is there anything that you'd be pleased to hear that we find on Sunday the 2nd of October?
Just anything, I guess. I helped Dad refloat boats in Mordialloc Creek, so I know the water quality in many of the places around there is questionable. So if you get anything, it'd be good.
Oh, we do get dragonflies and the occasional caddisfly.
Yep.
And frogs, of course.
Yep. No, that yeah. I reckon it sounds like the wetlands. I reckon will be quite nice. They'll be quite cool. I'm gonna have to go and stick a net in at some stage. You've inspired me now.
Good.
Next time I visit Dad.
Okay. Any other questions? No, you must have spoken about everything.
Endlessly.
Endlessly.
So I think it only remains to thank you very much, John. So well done. Thank you very much. Great talk.
Thanks.
And we'll send you a report of what we find when we.
That sounds excellent.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks,
Love to
John.
see you when you visit.
Cheers.
Okay. Thanks, John. So thanks everybody for coming, and you'll be on the newsletter list, and so you will get other talks. So we do them every 6 months. So you will get information about other talks like this in the future. So thanks for coming, and good night, everyone.
Good night.